In the autumn of 1884, a massive stone building stood at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue, staring out across an unfinished city. To the east lay Central Park, still young, still raw at its edges. To the west stretched open ground, rocky soil, scattered wooden structures, goat pastures, and empty lots broken only by dirt roads. This was not fashionable Manhattan. This was not society's New York. And yet, rising from that isolation was a structure that looked less like a residence and more like a fortress. Most New Yorkers thought it was a joke. They called it Clark's Folly. The nickname spread quickly, passed from newspaper columns to drawing rooms, repeated with a smirk. The implication was obvious. Only a fool would build something so grand, so expensive, so permanent, in a place where no one of consequence lived. The Upper West Side was considered remote, inconvenient, and socially irrelevant. Respectable families lived east of the park, in private townhouses along Fifth Avenue, close to clubs, churches, and one another. Living this far north, and worse, in an apartment, suggested compromise, not success. The building itself seemed to invite ridicule. It was enormous and unapologetically heavy, with steep roofs, gables, and a great arched entrance wide enough for carriages to pass through. It looked European. It looked old-fashioned. It looked like something that belonged to another century, dropped into a city racing toward the future. To critics, it felt almost defiant, a palace planted in the wilderness, daring the city to grow around it. No one expected it to work. Yet within weeks of opening, every apartment inside was occupied. There was no slow acceptance, no cautious testing period. By the time the doors officially opened, the building was already full. A waiting list had formed. The very people who were expected to reject apartment living, lawyers, financiers, merchants, professionals with families and servants, had signed leases and moved in without hesitation. The mockery collapsed under the weight of reality. What had been dismissed as madness became, almost overnight, the most sought-after address in New York City. This contradiction sits at the center of the story. The building, later celebrated as an icon, did not begin as a triumph. It began as an insult. It was conceived in doubt, constructed in isolation, and greeted with laughter. And yet it succeeded, decisively, completely, and faster than anyone predicted. The real question is not how the building was constructed. The real question is why it succeeded where logic said it should fail. At the time, apartment houses carried a stigma. They were associated with overcrowding, transience, and people who could not afford better. Wealth in New York expressed itself through land ownership, private entrances, and strict separation. Sharing walls with strangers was unthinkable. Riding elevators with neighbors felt undignified. Trusting a building, rather than personal staff, with one's comfort ran against everything elite families believed about control and status. And yet, all of that resistance collapsed inside this one structure. If stories like this, moments when cities change direction, when a single decision quietly reshapes how people live, are what you enjoy exploring, this is a good point to pause. Subscribing helps keep these stories coming, and your thoughts in the comments often shape which forgotten chapters of history come next. The building on 72nd Street did not convince the wealthy by accident. It did not benefit from a sudden shift in taste or a temporary shortage of land. It was the result of a calculated gamble by a man who believed that the future of American wealth would not look like its past. He was not an architect or a reformer. He was a businessman who understood something his contemporaries missed, that prosperity had created a class of people rich enough to demand luxury, but increasingly unwilling to manage it. People who wanted space, privacy, and dignity, without the burden of maintaining an ante. Ira mansioned to prove they deserved it. Instead of placing his experiment where success was guaranteed, he placed it where failure seemed certain. He chose land no one wanted. He built for people no one thought would come. And standing on the edge of Manhattan, surrounded by emptiness and ridicule, Edward Clark made a decision that would test everything New York believed about wealth, respectability, and where power was allowed to live. The fortune that made Clark's Folly possible did not come from land, railroads, or banking. It came from something far more ordinary: clothing. from stitches sewn into fabric by a machine that would quietly transform daily life across the world. At the center of that transformation was Isaac Merritt Singer. Singer was not born into privilege, nor did he follow a respectable path to wealth. Born in 1811 in upstate New York, he left home as a child with little formal education and spent much of his early life drifting from place to place. For years, he pursued a dream of becoming a famous actor, traveling with theater troupes that rarely paid well and often collapsed without warning. What Singer lacked in discipline, he made up for in charm, confidence, and an unusual mechanical intuition. By 1850, Singer found himself working in a Boston machine shop, asked to repair an early sewing machine that barely functioned. Instead of fixing it, he studied it. He saw its limitations immediately. Within days, working long hours with relentless focus, Singer built a radically improved version. His machine could sew continuously, handle curved seams, and operate at speeds unheard of at the time. Where hand sewing took hours, Singer's invention could do the same work in minutes. He secured a patent in 1851. A new industry was born. But Singer was not the man to build an empire. He was impulsive, extravagant, and deeply unreliable. He spent money as quickly as it arrived and showed little interest in contracts, accounting, or long-term planning. What Singer needed was someone who understood order, someone who could turn invention into infrastructure. That man was Edward Clark. Clark was Singer's opposite in almost every respect. Born the same year, 1811, Clark trained as a lawyer and built a reputation for caution, precision, and restraint. He valued stability over spectacle and structure over improvisation. Where Singer thrived on chaos, Clark eliminated it. Their partnership, formed in 1851, was uneasy from the start. They argued constantly. They distrusted one another. Yet together, they created one of the most profitable manufacturing businesses of the 19th century. Singer supplied the invention. Clark supplied the system. Clark's most revolutionary contribution had nothing to do with engineering. It was financial. At the time, a sewing machine cost more than $100, an enormous sum when the average American family earned only a few $100s per year. Almost no one could afford Singer's invention outright. Clark's solution was simple, radical, and devastatingly effective. He introduced installment payments. Customers could pay a small amount each month until the machine was theirs. This single decision changed everything. Middle-class households flooded the market. Sales exploded. The Singer Manufacturing Company became a global enterprise with factories, showrooms, and sales networks spreading across the United States and into Europe. While Singer reveled in his growing fame, Clark quietly built an empire behind the scenes. As the money poured in, Singer's personal life unraveled. He maintained multiple households simultaneously, fathering dozens of children with several women, many of whom believed they were his lawful wife. For years, the deception held. Then in 1860, it collapsed spectacularly in public view. Investigations revealed the scale of his duplicity, and the scandal dominated newspapers. Facing legal consequences and social ruin, Singer fled to England. There, he lived lavishly, built an enormous estate, married again, and continued spending without restraint. He never returned to live in America. When Singer died in 1875, he left behind a fortune estimated at roughly $13 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. His will divided the money unevenly among his children, reflecting old grudges and favoritism. But the real power lay not with Singer's heirs. It lay with Edward Clark. For decades, Clark had managed the business while Singer chased excess. Now, with the inventor gone, Clark emerged as the dominant force behind the Singer Manufacturing Company. He was in his 60s, extraordinarily wealthy, and free from the instability that had Ned, his partner's life. Clark had already proven he could build an industry. What remained was a question of legacy. He had no interest in flamboyant estates or social display. Instead, his attention turned toward a problem he believed no one else had solved: how wealth would live in a rapidly growing American city. Clark was rich, aging, and standing at a crossroads. The fortune made by sewing machines had freed him from necessity. What remained was choice, and he was about to place one final radical bet. In late 19th century New York, the word apartment carried a quiet insult. Apartments were where people lived when they had no other choice. Immigrants packed into tenements, laborers crowded into airless rooms, families without land or lineage. They were associated with noise, impermanence, and dependence. Respectable wealth expressed itself vertically and privately, behind a single front door, with servants' quarters tucked discreetly out of sight. A proper family owned its walls, its roof, its staircase. Sharing any of that with strangers suggested failure. For the elite, apartments were not merely undesirable. They were unacceptable. This belief shaped the city. Along Fifth Avenue and the streets just east of Central Park, private townhouses rose shoulder to shoulder, each one a declaration of status. The further north and west one traveled, the thinner that prestige became. Apartments existed, but only for those excluded from high society. No banker or industrialist would willingly trade a mansion for shared corridors and elevators. Edward Clark saw that certainty as a vulnerability. Clark had traveled widely and observed how wealth behaved outside the United States. In European cities, the social logic was different. In Paris, London, and Vienna, affluent families lived comfortably in grand apartment buildings without any loss of standing. These structures were not compromises. They were palaces divided into private residences, offering space, elegance, and discretion. Shared roofs did not imply shared lives. Status was preserved through scale, design, and service, not land ownership alone. New York, Clark believed, was clinging to an outdated idea. The city was growing faster than its traditions could adapt. Land values were climbing. Maintaining a private mansion required armies of servants, constant repairs, and relentless oversight. Wealth was becoming less about display and more about efficiency. Yet no one had dared to offer the rich an alternative that preserved their dignity. There had been attempts. A few respectable apartment houses had appeared in Manhattan during the 1860s and 1870s. They were clean, well-designed, and socially acceptable, but only to a point. These buildings catered to professionals and merchants, not to families accustomed to ballrooms, libraries, and private dining rooms. They proved that apartments could be respectable, but not that they could be luxurious. Clark was not interested in half measures. He believed the failure of earlier projects lay not in the idea of apartment living itself, but in their ambition. They asked wealthy families to downsize their lives. Clark intended to do the opposite. He wanted to offer them everything they already had: space, privacy, servants, comfort, while removing the burdens they quietly resented. His insight was simple but radical. Wealth no longer wanted castles. It wanted convenience. The truly prosperous did not enjoy managing coal deliveries, boiler maintenance, endless repairs, or the supervision of large domestic staffs. They wanted their homes to function smoothly without constant attention. They wanted freedom, not just space. And Clark believed they would accept shared infrastructure if it delivered private luxury. But to prove that idea, the building itself would have to overwhelm prejudice. It could not feel like an apartment house. It would need to feel like a palace that happened to contain multiple homes. Anything less would confirm the skeptics. Just as important was location. If Clark built in an established neighborhood, success could be dismissed as inevitable. He needed to demonstrate that the concept itself, not proximity to society, was what attracted tenants. So he looked away from Fifth Avenue, away from fashionable streets, away from approval. He chose land no one wanted, a stretch of Manhattan that polite society avoided, where critics would be certain he had made a fatal mistake. A place where an apartment palace would look absurd until it didn't. By selecting the most unfashionable ground in the city, Edward Clark ensured that if his experiment succeeded, there would be no doubt why. In 1880, the Upper West Side was not a neighborhood in any meaningful sense. It was a margin, a stretch of Manhattan that polite society passed by without comment. West of Central Park, the land sloped unevenly toward the Hudson River, broken by rocky outcrops, scattered wooden buildings, and long runs of open ground. Some parcels still functioned as small farms or pasture. Others sat empty, waiting for a future few believed would ever arrive. Compared to the east side of the park, the contrast was stark. Fifth Avenue had filled quickly with townhouses and mansions after the park opened in the 1860s. Wealth had rushed there, clustering near clubs, churches, and theaters. The west side, steeper and less convenient, lagged behind. It lacked shops, lacked services, and most importantly, lacked social gravity. Transportation made the problem worse. For anyone living near 72nd Street in 1880, daily life required planning and patience. Walking to the commercial districts downtown could take more than an hour. Horse-drawn omnibuses were slow, crowded, and unreliable. There were no subways, no quick routes. Visiting friends, attending dinners, or managing business affairs meant committing to long journeys across a city that was still expanding outward rather than upward. To skeptics, this isolation alone doomed the project. When Edward Clark purchased land at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue, observers questioned not just his judgment, but his sanity. The plot covered roughly 41,000 square feet and sat on a slight rise, offering open views and direct access to Central Park. Clark saw promise in those features. His critics saw emptiness. They began calling the project Clark's Folly in earnest. The name Dakota emerged around this time, though its exact origin remains debated. Some believed it referred to the building's remoteness, so far from civilization that it might as well be in the Western Territories. Others suggested Clark himself favored names associated with newly settled American regions and had even proposed renaming nearby avenues after Western places. Whatever the truth, the nickname stuck, carrying with it an implication of distance, risk, and miscalculation. There were, however, changes underway that Clark understood better than most. In 1879, the 9th Avenue Elevated Railway opened, creating the first reliable transit link between the Upper West Side and Lower Manhattan. The trains were loud and intrusive, but they were fast. For the first time, living west of the park did not mean permanent separation from the rest of the city. Clark recognized what this signaled. The question was no longer whether the neighborhood would develop, but when, and who would be first to commit. Timing mattered as much as location. Clark believed that if he built before the rush, he could shape the future rather than follow it. By placing a massive, unmistakable structure in the area, he would announce that the Upper West Side was no longer speculative ground. It was open for serious investment. The Dakota would not wait for the city to arrive. It would force the city to follow. The scale of the gamble reflected that ambition. Clark authorized a construction budget of approximately $2 million, an enormous sum for a residential building at the time. Individual apartments would cost around $25,000 each to build, more than 3 times what Clark had spent per unit on earlier apartment experiments. He instructed his architect to spare no expense. This would not be an experiment in economy. It would be an assertion of confidence. The skeptics watched as construction plans circulated and foundations were marked out on land they considered worthless. They predicted vacancy, financial loss, and humiliation. They believed wealthy families would never tolerate such distance from society, no matter how impressive the building itself might be. Edward Clark listened. Then he proceeded anyway. In late October of 1880, work began. Stone was hauled onto empty lots. Walls rose where goats had grazed. A fortress took shape in a place no one thought worth a disassen, fending. As the structure climbed higher, the jokes continued. The ridicule sharpened. Failure seemed inevitable. Construction had begun. The money was committed. And as critics confidently predicted disaster, Clark had no way back. If Edward Clark provided the idea, it was Henry Janeway Hardenberg who made that idea believable in stone. Hardenberg was only in his early 30s when Clark entrusted him with the most ambitious residential project in New York. He was not yet famous, but he was unusually prepared. Born in New Jersey in 1847, Hardenberg followed the traditional European path of architectural apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. He trained under Detlef Leonau, a German-born architect educated in Paris, absorbing design traditions that most American architects encountered only through books. That European influence mattered. Clark was not looking for novelty. He was looking for authority. The building had to feel established the moment it opened, as though it had always belonged to the city. Hardenberg responded with a design that defied easy classification. Critics would later argue over whether it drew more from German Renaissance, French chateau architecture, or Victorian eclecticism. The truth was simpler. It looked old, heavy, and permanent. Exactly what Clark needed. The exterior rose 8 stories, capped by steep roofs, dormers, gables, and chimneys that broke the skyline into a jagged silhouette. Buff-colored brick dominated the facade, trimmed with sandstone and decorated with terracotta panels. There was no attempt at lightness, no glassy openness. The building projected mass and confidence, the architectural equivalent of crossed arms. At street level, Hardenberg placed the feature that would define the building's relationship with its residents, a vast arched entrance on 72nd Street. The opening was large enough for horse-drawn carriages to pass through without slowing. A family could arrive home, remain seated, and be carried directly inside, shielded from weather, crowds, and public view. This single decision addressed one of the elite's deepest anxieties: exposure. The Dakota offered privacy not by retreating inward, but by swallowing the street whole. Beyond the arch lay the courtyard. Hardenberg organized the building around a central open space, creating a footprint that allowed light and air to reach apartments on all sides. In an era before air conditioning, this was not merely aesthetic, it was practical and reassuring. The courtyard also served as a controlled interior world, separating residents from the noise and disorder of the city beyond the walls. The design went further. The courtyard was split into 2 functional levels. The upper level, visible to residents, was reserved for arrivals and daily life. Beneath it ran a hidden service level accessed by ramps from adjacent streets. Delivery wagons could enter, unload supplies, and depart without ever crossing paths with residents. Groceries, coal, ice, and refuse moved through the building unseen. Inside, Hardenberg planned 65 apartments, deliberately ensuring that no 2 were identical. This was a direct response to elite psychology. Families accustomed to private mansions expected their homes to feel singular, not standardized. Apartments ranged from modest multi-room residences to sprawling homes of up to 20 rooms, large enough to accommodate extended families and live-in staff. Social separation was engineered into the structure. Passenger staircases and elevators occupied the corners of the courtyard, reserved for residents and guests. Separate service staircases and service elevators ran through the interior, connecting kitchens and back rooms. Servants could move through the building without disturbing family life. Deliveries arrived without spectacle. The hierarchies of Gilded Age society were preserved, not challenged. The structure itself reinforced the sense of safety and permanence. Instead of newer steel frame methods, the Dakota relied on traditional load-bearing masonry. Foundation walls measured several feet thick. Iron beams and concrete floors added strength. Between floor layers, builders packed mud taken from Central Park, a technique intended to reduce noise and slow the spread of fire. In an era haunted by urban fires, this mattered. The building also incorporated technology that was advanced but carefully controlled. Central heating eliminated the need for individual furnaces. Hydraulic elevators reduced physical strain while remaining slow and deliberate enough to feel dignified rather than mechanical. Even the power plant was placed beneath an adjacent garden, so any catastrophic failure would not threaten the apartments themselves. Everything about the Dakota communicated the same message. This building would take care of its residents. As the walls rose through 1881 and 1882, critics watched uneasily. What they had mocked as folly was becoming formidable. The structure did not look temporary. It did not look experimental. It looked inevitable. But as the fortress took shape, the man who had conceived it was growing weaker. Edward Clark would never see the Dakota finished. As the walls of the Dakota climbed higher above 72nd Street, Edward Clark's health began to fail. By 1882, the building's outline was unmistakable. Its mass dominated the empty blocks of the Upper West Side. The Great Archway was in place. The gables and roof lines were taking form. To passers-by, the project no longer looked speculative. It looked permanent. For Clark, it should have been the moment of quiet satisfaction, the phase when risk gives way to inevitability. He never reached it. That autumn, Clark fell seriously ill at his country estate in Cooperstown. The illness progressed quickly. At 70 years old, after decades of disciplined work and careful calculation, the man who had managed one of America's great industrial fortunes found himself far from the building that embodied his final conviction. On October 14, 1882, Edward Clark died of malarial fever. The Dakota was still unfinished. The apartments he had imagined in such detail remained hollow shells. The dining rooms were incomplete. The services that would make the building function like a self-contained world had not yet been installed. Clark's own apartment, the one he reportedly intended to customize lavishly, existed only on paper. He never walked through the courtyard, never passed beneath the archway, never watched families arrive and decide in a single glance that this was where they would live. In death, Clark received conventional praise. Obituaries focused on his role at the Singer Manufacturing Company, on the fortune he had built through legal precision and business discipline. The apartment house rising on the Upper West Side was mentioned, but only briefly, as an eccentric side project, an odd gamble whose outcome was still uncertain. The most extraordinary aspect of Clark's passing was what followed. His estate, valued at tens of millions of dollars, passed largely to his grands, on Edward Severin Clark, who was only 12 years old. The boy was far too young to manage a fortune, let alone oversee the completion of the most ambitious residential building in New York. Control of the Dakota fell instead to a group of trustees appointed to manage the estate during the child's minority. This could have been the end of the experiment. Trustees are not visionaries. They are stewards. They are tasked with preservation, not risk. Faced with rising costs and public skepticism, lesser managers might have scaled back the project, simplified the interiors, or diluted the services Clark had planned. Doing so would have protected the estate and reduced exposure. They did none of that. The trustees chose to complete the Dakota exactly as Clark intended. Hardenberg remained as architect. The materials were not downgraded. The layout was not compromised. The services were not trimmed. Every decision honored the original plans, as though Clark were still watching. Construction continued through 1883. There were delays. Labor disputes briefly slowed progress. But the momentum held. By the time finishing work began, the question was no longer whether the building would open, but when. Clark did not live to see the mockery fade. He did not witness the waiting list form. He never heard critics reverse themselves. The vindication of his idea arrived after his death, carried out by others who believed enough in his judgment to finish what he started. Edward Clark was gone before proof arrived. The man who had bet his fortune on a future he would never see had placed his trust in stone. By the autumn of 1884, the jokes had nowhere left to stand. After 4 years of construction, the great building at 72nd Street and 8th Avenue was ready. Its walls were finished, its systems installed, its interiors polished into something closer to a European palace than an American apartment house. The name that had begun as a taunt now appeared formally in real estate notices. The Dakota was opening its doors. The terms alone should have frightened potential tenants away. Annual rents ranged from roughly $2,500 to $5,000, depending on the size of the apartment. These were not modest sums. They placed the Dakota squarely among the most expensive residential options in the city. And yet, months before the official opening date, a quarter of the apartments were already taken. By the time the building was declared ready for occupancy in late October, every single unit had been claimed. There were no vacancies. The residents who moved in were not society's most famous names. They were not members of the old social elite clustered around Fifth Avenue. Instead, they represented exactly the class Edward Clark had been targeting from the beginning: prosperous professionals, lawyers, brokers, merchants, manufacturers, and senior clerks. People with money, families, and expectations, but also with busy lives and little interest in managing large private houses. These tenants were wealthy but practical. They arrived with servants, furniture, and routines already formed. What they found inside the Dakota was not a compromise, but an upgrade. Apartments were large enough to preserve domestic hierarchies. Separate service circulation allowed staff to work without intruding on family life. Central heating eliminated the constant labor of managing coal and furnaces. Elevators removed the physical strain of daily movement through the building. Deliveries arrived invisibly. Main, tenants happened without negotiation. Most importantly, the building worked. This was the quiet victory Clark had predicted. The Dakota did not need advertising or social endorsement. Its success spread by observation. Visitors came, saw the interiors, noted the absence of chaos, and reconsidered their assumptions. The stigma attached to apartment living began to crack. The press noticed the reversal almost immediately. Publications that had once mocked the project now praised it. One prominent newspaper described the Dakota as among the most perfect apartment houses in the world. Trade journals credited both the architect and the developer with creating something genuinely new. The phrase, "Clark's Folly," once delivered with amusement, faded from use. What had changed was not the building, but perception. The Dakota demonstrated that elite apartment living could preserve status rather than dilute it. Sharing a roof no longer implied crowding or anonymity. In the right structure, it meant efficiency, comfort, and control. The wealthy had not abandoned their standards. They had simply found a better way to meet them. Equally important was what did not happen. There was no exodus back to private houses. No wave of dissatisfied tenants, no scandal involving noise, mismanagement, or social conflict. The building filled and stayed full. Families settled in. Children grew up inside its walls. The Dakota became, almost immediately, a stable community rather than a transient address. Its presence changed the Upper West Side as well. Investors who had once dismissed the area began to reconsider. Other residential projects followed. Shops appeared. Services expanded. Transportation improved. What had been dismissed as wilderness was now visibly connected to the city's future. The Dakota had done more than succeed. It had anchored an entire neighborhood. By the mid-1880s, the question of whether the building would work was no longer asked. The experiment was over. The result was clear. An apartment house built for the wealthy in the least fashionable part of Manhattan had proven not only viable but desirable. Clark's gamble had paid off. The building was full. Its reputation was secure. And what had begun as folly had become something far more difficult to undo, a permanent fixture of New York life. For most buildings in New York, success marks the beginning of change. Rising demand brings higher rents. Higher rents bring turnover. Turnover brings renovation, subdivision, and eventually reinvention. The city rewards what adapts quickly and discards what does not. By those rules, the Dakota should have transformed repeatedly over the decades that followed its opening. It didn't. The reason was simple. The building was never treated as a business in the ordinary sense. After Edward Clark's death, ownership of the Dakota remained within the Clark family. His grandson, Edward Severin Clark, inherited the property as a child, with trustees managing it until he came of age. When he assumed control in the 1890s, the Dakota was already everything his grandfather had envisioned: full, respected, and profitable enough to sustain itself without pressure. But profit was never the priority. The Clarks were heirs to the Singer manufacturing fortune. The rental income from a single apartment house, no matter how prestigious, was insignificant compared to the dividends flowing from a global industrial empire. This financial independence shaped every decision they made as landlords. Rents remained deliberately low, often unchanged for years at a time. Increases, when they came, were modest and infrequent. This was not generosity in the sentimental sense. It was indifference to maximization. The Dakota did not need to squeeze its tenants. It did not need to chase the market. It could afford stability. And that stability produced something increasingly rare in New York: permanence. Between 1884 and the onset of the Great Depression, the building reportedly never experienced a single vacancy. Families moved in and stayed. Children grew up inside its walls and, in some cases, took apartments of their own when they married. Long-term residence became the norm. rather than the exception, and the building began to feel less like an address and more like a self-contained village. This continuity shaped the character of its residents. From an early stage, the Dakota attracted people who valued culture as much as capital. Members of the Steinway family lived there, bringing with them the world of music and performance. Other tenants were patrons of the arts, collectors, publishers, and professionals whose wealth supported creative life rather than purely commercial ambition. The building developed a reputation not just for luxury, but for discretion and seriousness. It was respectable without being ostentatious. Because the Clarks were not driven by profit, they had no incentive to subdivide apartments, modernize aggressively, or replace long-term tenants with wealthier newcomers. The services that defined Dakota living evolved slowly, disappearing only as social norms changed. What remained constant was the structure itself, the scale of the apartments, the thickness of the walls, the quiet enforced by design rather than rules. As Manhattan transformed around it, the Dakota stood apart. Skyscrapers rose, neighborhoods shifted, entire districts were rebuilt to suit new economic realities. Yet the Dakota remained almost exactly as it had been at the moment of its success. It did not chase fashion. It did not adapt itself to speculation. It simply endured. By the early 20th century, the building had become an anomaly, a relic of Gilded Age ambition preserved not by law but by circumstance. It survived because no one who owned it needed to extract everything it could produce. In a city defined by change, the Dakota's greatest advantage was that it never had to hurry. For 77 years, the Dakota had been protected by a single fact. It belonged to a family that did not need it. That protection ended in 1960. On September 17th of that year, Stephen Carlton Clark died at the age of 78. He was the last Clark to control the building directly, and like his predecessors, he had treated the Dakota less as an asset than as a responsibility. Under his stewardship, rents remained modest, maintenance was handled quietly, and the building continued to operate much as it had for decades. When his will was read, the tenants expected continuity. Instead, they discovered that the Dakota had been left to the Clark Foundation, the philanthropic organization Stephen Clark had established to support causes in Cooperstown, the family's ancestral home. At first glance, this seemed reassuring. A foundation, after all, was unlikely to act impulsively. It suggested stewardship rather than speculation. The reality was far more dangerous. Under New York state law, a charitable foundation could not retain ownership of property that failed to generate sufficient profit. The Dakota, for all its prestige, had never been run to maximize income. Artificially low rents, extensive maintenance, and long-term tenants meant that the building barely broke even. What had once been its greatest strength now became a liability. The foundation had no choice. To comply with the law, it would have to sell. News of the impending sale spread quickly through the building. For many residents, the Dakota was not simply an address but a lifetime home. Some had lived there for decades. Others were elderly, settled, and unable to imagine starting over elsewhere in a city that had grown harsher and more expensive with each passing year. They also understood what a sale would likely mean. By 1960, Manhattan real estate had entered a new phase. Developers no longer valued thick walls, courtyards, or architectural character. They valued height, square footage, efficiency. Buildings like the Dakota, with large apartments and limited unit counts, were increasingly seen as obsolete. The land beneath them was often worth more than the structures themselves. That reality soon announced itself. Developers began circling almost immediately. One of the first to make his presence known was William Zeckendorf, the most aggressive real estate operator in the city, famous for replacing old buildings with modern towers of steel and glass. His reputation alone was enough to alarm the tenants. Wherever Zeckendorf went, demolition followed. Offers were made. Deadlines were imposed. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars for the site alone. For the foundation, the decision was straightforward. The Dakota was unprofitable. The offers were legal, lucrative, and final. For the residents, the implications were existential. If the building were sold, they would not merely face higher rents. They would likely face eviction. The Dakota could be razed, replaced by a modern apartment tower bearing no resemblance to the fortress they called home. Nearly 80 years of continuity could disappear behind a wrecking ball. Panic set in. On a Friday afternoon in December 1960, tenants received confirmation that a sale was imminent. There was no long runway, no drawn-out negotiation. The building could change hands within days. Over a weekend, residents were forced to confront the possibility that the Dakota's long immunity from market forces had finally run out. An emergency meeting was called. It took place in the building's old dining room, a space that once symbolized the ease and privilege of Dakota living. Now it filled with fear. Elderly residents wept openly. Long-term tenants argued, shouted, and you demanded answers no one had yet found. Some had nowhere else to go. Others simply refused to believe that the building could be destroyed after surviving for so long. What united them was a single realization. If they did nothing, they would lose everything. The Dakota had outlasted ridicule, isolation, and changing fashions. It had survived because it was protected by wealth that did not need to exploit it. That protection was gone. For the first time in its history, the building faced an enemy it could not ignore: the market itself. And now, the people inside its walls would have to decide whether they were willing and able to save it themselves. The Dakota had always been protected from the city by ownership. Now, for the first time, survival would depend on the people who lived inside it. In the days following the emergency meeting, a small group of tenants began to organize. They understood the reality clearly. Appeals to sentiment would not stop a developer. Public outrage alone would not reverse a sale. If the building was to be saved, it would have to be purchased outright by those who called it home. The idea was radical, but it was also the only option. Tenants began exploring the structure of a cooperative corporation, a model still unfamiliar to many New Yorkers at the time. Under this arrangement, residents would no longer rent individual apartments. Instead, they would collectively own the building, each purchasing shares tied to their unit and assuming responsibility for its future. It was a daunting proposition. The purchase price alone ran into the millions. Beyond that lay ongoing maintenance, repairs, staffing, taxes, and utilities, costs that had previously been absorbed quietly by the Clark family. Now, those expenses would fall directly on the residents. For some, the numbers were impossible. Others realized they would need to liquidate assets, borrow heavily, or leave the building they had lived in for decades. Negotiations moved quickly. Developers were not inclined to wait. The Clark Foundation, bound by legal requirements, needed a resolution. Amid this pressure, tenant representatives entered talks with prospective buyers, working to delay demolition while assembling a credible counteroffer. The process was tense, compressed, and uncertain. There were no guarantees that enough residents could raise the required capital in time. But momentum built. Many tenants were wealthy in their own right: executives, professionals, and artists who had benefited from decades of low rents. Others had connections to finance, media, and law. Resources were pooled, advisors were consulted, legal frameworks were drafted. What had begun as panic gradually transformed into action. By early 1961, a deal was reached. The tenants agreed to purchase the Dakota for approximately $4.8 million, a figure slightly higher than what a developer had recently paid, but one that secured the building's future intact. The transaction required every participating resident to commit financially. There were no silent benefactors, no external saviors. Ownership would belong only to those willing to assume responsibility. The consequences were immediate and uneven. Long-term tenants who had paid artificially low rents for years now faced sharply higher monthly charges. Some could not make the transition. A small number were forced to leave, casualties of a shift from benevolent ownership to economic reality. Others stretched themselves thin, betting their financial security on the belief that the building was worth saving. In November of 1961, the conversion was finalized. For the first time since its completion in 1884, the Dakota was no longer owned by a single family or institution. It belonged to its residents. Decisions that had once been made quietly by distant landlords were now debated in board meetings. Rules were formalized. Finances were scrutinized. Preservation became a collective responsibility rather than an inherited habit. The immediate threat of demolition vanished. The adjacent lot to the west, once used as gardens and mechanical space, was sold separately and later developed. The Dakota itself remained untouched. Its walls, courtyard, and apartments survived intact, not because they were profitable, but because enough people believed they mattered. This shift fundamentally changed the building's identity. What had once been a paternalistic arrangement, generous owners and loyal tenants, became a community bound by shared risk. The residents were no longer insulated from market forces. They had chosen to face them together. The decision to fight back had saved the Dakota, but IT had also transformed it. The building was no longer merely a place to live. It was an obligation, an inheritance, and a statement of values. After nearly 80 years, the Dakota had come full circle. It had begun as one man's gamble against conventional wisdom. Now it stood, because those inside its walls were willing to gamble on it themselves. By the late 1960s, the Dakota had survived ridicule, isolation, neglect, and near demolition. What it had not yet survived was transformation. That came not from real estate or finance, but from the imagination. In 1967, director Roman Polanski arrived in New York searching for a building that could carry a mood before a single line of dialogue was spoken. He was adapting a best-selling novel by Ira Levin, a psychological horror story about a young couple who move into an old Manhattan apartment building where something feels profoundly wrong. The building in the novel was fictional. On screen, it would be real. Polanski chose the Dakota. From the first exterior shots, the building did exactly what he needed. The steep roof lines, the heavy masonry, the shadowed archway, everything about it suggested history, secrecy, and enclosure. It did not look modern. It did not look friendly. It looked like a place where rules were made long ago and never revisited. The film, released in 1968 as Rosemary's Baby, renamed the building the Bramford. The Dakota's management refused to allow filming inside, but it didn't matter. The exterior was enough. The archway, the facade, the mass of the structure looming over the street, these elements became inseparable from the story itself. Audiences responded immediately. The film was a critical and commercial success, praised for its restraint and psychological tension. It earned millions at the box office and embedded the image of the Dakota in popular culture as something unsettling, a place where ordinary life masked darker currents. For the first time, millions of people around the world recognized the building without knowing its name. The Dakota had become a character. This new identity did not replace its old one. It layered over it. The building was still a prestigious address, still private, still discreet, but it now carried an aura that money alone could not buy. Mystery, atmosphere, myth. Public fascination followed. Tourists began to gather outside its gates. Film enthusiasts pointed out the entrance. The name Dakota circulated beyond New York, associated not just with wealth, but with imagination and unease. The building had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a place where important people lived. It was a place people talked about. That attention coincided with a deeper shift inside its walls. The Dakota had always attracted residents with cultural interests, but now creative figures arrived in greater numbers. Actors, musicians, writers, and composers found something appealing in the building's scale and separation. The apartments were large enough to work in. The walls were thick enough to protect silence. The management was famously uninterested in publicity. What had once been a refuge for industrial wealth became a sanctuary for creative fame. Unlike newer luxury buildings, the Dakota did not advertise status through novelty. It offered privacy through permanence. There were no doormen selling access, no glass walls inviting attention. Fame could exist here without being performed. This reputation spread quietly, person to person. By the early 1970s, living at the Dakota signaled something different than it had in the Gilded Age. It was no longer about industrial power or inherited wealth. It was about cultural gravity. about choosing distance from the city's noise without leaving the city itself. Then in 1973, two names appeared on the list of potential residents that would permanently fuse the building's history with global fame. A former Beatle and his wife were looking for a home. John Lennon and Yoko Ono were searching for a place that offered space, discretion, and a sense of rootedness. They wanted something older than celebrity, something that did not revolve around them. They chose the Dakota. With their arrival, the building's transformation was complete. Thus, what had begun as an experiment in elite living had become a symbol, layered with history, art, imagination, and soon, tragedy. The Dakota was no longer just where people lived. It was where stories gathered. For 7 years, the Dakota had offered John Lennon something he had never truly known: ordinary domestic life. When Lennon and Yoko Ono moved into the building in 1973, they did not arrive as social figures. They arrived quietly, almost cautiously. The apartment they chose was large but inward-looking, heavy with dark wood, brass fixtures, and thick walls that absorbed sound. Lennon later remarked that it reminded him of Victorian England, of childhood spaces that felt enclosed and safe. Inside the Dakota, fame softened. After years of global exposure, Lennon withdrew from public life. Following the birth of his son in 1975, he stepped away from recording entirely. For 5 years, he lived as a private citizen. He cooked, he baked bread, he walked through Central Park with a stroller. He spent afternoons watching the seasons change from the apartment windows. His guitar often hung untouched. Neighbors came to know him not as a former Beatle, but as a polite, eccentric presence in the courtyard. He attended building gatherings. He avoided parties. He sought routine. The Dakota's isolation from spectacle allowed him to exist without performance. It was, by all accounts, the calmest period of his life. That calm did not last. In 1980, something shifted. Lennon traveled alone to Bermuda, carrying an acoustic guitar. Away from New York, away from obligations, he began writing again. Songs came quickly, reflections on age, family, loss, and renewal. He returned energized, reunited with music not as obligation, but as choice. He and Ono decided to record together. The result was Double Fantasy, an album structured as a conversation between them. Released in November 1980, it marked Lennon's return after 5 years of silence. Reviews were mixed, but the response was immediate. Lennon gave interviews again. He spoke openly about domestic life, about contentment, about the future. Plans were forming. On the afternoon of December 8, 1980, Lennon and Ono were at the studio working on a track of hers, Walking on Thin Ice. Lennon added guitar parts late into the evening. When they finished, he turned to her and remarked that the song would be a hit. They left the studio together, heading home. It was nearly 11 p.m. when their car pulled up to the Dakota. Lennon stepped out first. As he walked toward the arched entrance, the same threshold that had once symbolized privacy and protection, he was shot multiple times by a man who had been waiting outside. Lennon collapsed near the doorway. Ono ran inside for help. Emergency services arrived quickly, but there was nothing to be done. John Lennon was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The news spread with stunning speed. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the Dakota. Candles appeared along the sidewalk. Flowers piled up near the gates. Radios played Beatles songs through the night. Across the world, people struggled to reconcile the quiet domestic image Lennon had recently projected with the violence of his death. The building itself became inseparable from the event. The Dakota was no longer just a residence associated with culture and privacy. It was the site of a moment that felt final, not only for Lennon, but for an era. The archway that had once swallowed carriages and shielded families from the street became a global symbol of loss. Nothing about the building changed physically. Its walls remained thick, its courtyard remained quiet, its apartments remained private, but its meaning had shifted permanently. The Dakota had crossed from history into memory, from address into landmark, from shelter into symbol. From that night forward, the building would always carry two identities: the place where John Lennon lived and the place where he died. The Dakota had survived ridicule, neglect, and near destruction. Now it would survive remembrance. In the days after John Lennon's death, grief spilled outward from the Dakota and settled across the street into Central Park. What began as spontaneous gatherings, candles, flowers, quiet singing, slowly took on a more permanent shape. Yoko Ono made a decision that would define how the loss would be remembered. There would be no statue. Lennon, she believed, would not have wanted a monument that froze him in stone. What he would have wanted was something living, something open, something shared. In 1981, a small, teardrop-shaped section of Central Park directly opposite the Dakota was officially designated as Strawberry Fields, named after the song Lennon had written years earlier, itself inspired by a place from his childhood in Liverpool. Ono envisioned it as a garden of peace, a space that belonged not to one nation or culture, but to the world. The response was extraordinary. More than 100 countries contributed trees, plants, and stones. Maples arrived from Canada, tulips from the Netherlands, dogwoods from Monaco, and oak from Great Britain. Ono herself donated $1 million to fund both the creation of the memorial and its long-term care. The design was overseen by the Central Park Conservancy, ensuring the space would feel integrated rather than imposed. At the center of Strawberry Fields, artisans from Naples created a circular black and white mosaic. At its heart was a single word: imagine. The mosaic was simple, almost modest, yet it became one of the most visited spots in Central Park. Fans from around the world came to sit nearby, to leave flowers, to sing quietly with strangers. On Lennon's birthday and on the anniversary of his death, the space filled with music. The memorial was designated a quiet zone, but silence was rarely what people sought. What they wanted was connection. Across the street, the Dakota watched in stillness. The building never opened itself to the public. Its gates remained closed. Its residents continued to value discretion above all else. In this way, the Dakota and Strawberry Fields formed a kind of balance: openness and enclosure, remembrance and privacy, public grief and private life. Over time, the Dakota's status solidified. It was designated a New York City landmark, then added to the National Register of Historic Places, and eventually recognized as a National Historic Landmark. These protections preserved its exterior and ensured that the fortress Edward Clark built would not be erased by fashion or speculation. Inside, life continued quietly. The cooperative board became famously selective. Wealth alone was not enough. Applicants were judged on discretion, temperament, and compatibility with a culture that prized silence over spectacle. Many famous names were rejected. The building did not seek attention. It defended itself from it. Today, apartments sell for sums that would have astonished Clark. Yet the Dakota's essence has not changed. It remains heavy, inward-looking, and resistant to the city's constant reinvention. It does not advertise itself. It does not explain itself. That endurance is the final proof of Clark's vision. What began as folly on the edge of the city became something singular, a building that outlived its maker, absorbed history without surrendering to it, and remained exactly what it was meant to be. A place that refuses to move, a place that does not apologize for staying. The Dakota endures, defiant, enclosed, unchanged, just as Edward Clark intended. The Dakota still stands at the edge of Central Park, heavy with memory, unchanged by the city that rushed past it. It was built to defy expectation, to protect privacy, and to endure long after its maker was gone. More than a century later, it has done exactly that. If stories like this matter to you, stories where ambition, risk, and time collide to shape the cities we live in, take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep these histories alive. And if this story changed how you see the Dakota or New York itself, share your thoughts in the comments below. Some buildings fade, some are erased, a few refuse to disappear.